The morning sun filtered gently through the windows of the modest two-story house on the edge of Silver Creek. Inside, the kitchen was quiet except for the soft clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug and the steady breathing of a golden retriever lying beside the table. 7-year-old Ethan Walker sat perched on a chair, his small hands smudged with dry glue and paint. His brows were furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the final piece of a homemade picture frame. The photograph inside was worn but precious, his parents in their army uniforms, standing beside his grandfather Howard, who had one arm around Ethan, barely 5 at the time, missing his front teeth and grinning wide. "Almost done, Rocky," Ethan whispered, holding the frame up to the light. The dog, sensing the emotion in his boy's voice, lifted his head. Rocky didn't wag his tail, but his warm eyes followed Ethan's every move. He was always watching, always waiting, silent but vigilant. Ethan placed the frame carefully on the table and picked up a folded piece of lined paper. His handwriting wobbled with effort, but each word had been written with care. It was the third attempt at the letter. The first 2 lay crumpled in the trash can. This one, he hoped, was just right. "Dear Grandpa, I miss you even when you're just at the hospital. I hope this picture makes you smile. It's from my heart. Love, Ethan." He tucked the note behind the photo, sealing the frame with a final press. Rocky let out a low, short breath and stood, stepping closer as Ethan zipped the gift into his backpack. The boy's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. They both knew today wasn't just another visit. Howard Walker had been Ethan's whole world since the accident that took his parents 3 years ago. A former military dog trainer, Howard had brought Rocky into their home through a government program for veterans. What no one expected was how quickly Rocky would bond with Ethan, how the trained war dog would become the child's shadow. Ethan slid off the chair and looked at Rocky. "Ready?" he asked softly. Rocky didn't move at first. Then he walked to the door, sat, and waited. Ethan smiled. That meant yes. They were ready. Ethan pulled his backpack over his shoulders, careful not to jostle the picture frame inside. Rocky walked beside him as they stepped out onto the porch. The morning was cool, and the sidewalks of Silver Creek were still empty, lined with golden leaves clinging to early autumn branches. Miss Harper, the home nurse who had stayed overnight, stood at the doorway with a worried expression. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you once my shift ends, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "It's a long way to the hospital on foot." Ethan shook his head, his voice steady. "I have to get there before Grandpa gets his medicine. The nurse said it makes him too sleepy to talk. He told me he wanted to see me today. He said it was important." Miss Harper hesitated, glancing down at Rocky, who stood calm and alert at Ethan's side. The navy blue service vest across Rocky's back bore the official patch, "Medical Alert, Trained K-9 Unit." She sighed. "All right. But you have to promise me 2 things. 1, you'll call when you get there. And 2, Rocky doesn't leave your side for even 1 second." "I promise," Ethan said. "Rocky never leaves me." She nodded, still unsure, but stepped back to let them pass. Instead of heading along the main road, Ethan turned left at the end of the block and entered Forest View Park through the side trail. It was a familiar path, one he and Rocky had walked many times. He liked how it cut right through town, like a secret tunnel hidden in plain sight. The park was unusually quiet. No children played on the swings, and the picnic tables sat empty beneath the large oaks. A few scattered joggers passed in the distance, but otherwise, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Ethan didn't mind the silence. It gave him time to think about what he wanted to say to Grandpa. Rocky walked slightly ahead, his head level, ears shifting with every sound. The dog's presence made Ethan feel braver, like nothing bad could happen as long as Rocky was near. A breeze rustled the leaves above as they passed the old wooden pavilion near the center of the park. Rocky slowed. His body tensed, just enough that Ethan noticed. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered. Rocky didn't answer. He just kept walking, but now his steps were cautious. Something wasn't right. As they reached the far bend of the trail, the trees began to thin, revealing a stretch of cracked pavement that led toward the park's central plaza. Ethan hesitated. Up ahead, the low growl of motorcycle engines rumbled in the air like distant thunder. Rocky stopped. His body stiffened, head slightly lowered, eyes locked on the movement beyond the clearing. Ethan followed his gaze. 5 motorcycles, gleaming black and chrome, were parked in a semicircle across the path. Around them stood a group of men in heavy leather jackets, their backs marked with a patch Ethan didn't recognize but instinctively feared: iron vultures. The biggest man among them turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. His beard was streaked with gray, his frame wide and thick like a bear. His eyes locked onto Ethan with a strange mix of confusion and recognition. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "What do we have here?" Ethan stopped, frozen. His fingers gripped the strap of his backpack. Rocky moved in front of him, blocking his body partially with his own. The man stepped closer. "You lost, kid? Or did someone send you?" Ethan tried to find his voice. "I'm just going to the hospital. My grandpa's there. Please let us pass." The man's face darkened. "What's your name?" "Ethan. Ethan Walker." "Walker," the man muttered, like he was tasting the name. Then he narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that? You look an awful lot like someone I used to know." "A man named Carson." Ethan blinked. "I don't know any Carson. My dad's name was David Walker. He died with my mom in Afghanistan." Another man stepped forward, younger, wary, with sharp eyes. "Caleb, maybe this isn't." "Quiet, Mason," the big man snapped. He stared at Ethan again, as if trying to see past the boy's face and into his blood. "You're lying," he growled. "You're too young to know anything, but your grandpa, he knows. Tell me where John Carson is hiding." "I don't know who that is," Ethan said, his voice shaking now. "I need to see my grandpa. That's all." Caleb's boots crunched against the gravel as he closed the distance. Rocky growled low, a warning that was ignored. "Maybe we take you both," Caleb muttered. "Your grandpa will talk fast enough if he sees you in trouble." The words barely left his mouth when his hand shot out. He grabbed Ethan's arm hard, too hard, and twisted. A sickening crack echoed through the trees. Ethan screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his arm. Rocky exploded forward. But the real fight was only beginning. The moment Ethan's scream pierced the air, Rocky shifted. The calm, gentle service dog vanished. In his place stood a precise, disciplined K9 unit trained for combat. His body moved like a coiled spring released, launching toward Caleb with silent, terrifying speed. Caleb barely had time to register the movement before Rocky slammed into him, jaws clamping down hard on his forearm. The force drove the biker backward, staggering him off balance. He yelled, not just from pain but from shock. "Get this mutt off me!" Rocky didn't bark. He didn't snarl. He didn't make a sound. His actions were clean, mechanical, rehearsed. Every muscle moved with intention. The other bikers jumped back instinctively. One reached for something under his jacket but stopped when he caught the glint of the K9 patch now fully visible on Rocky's vest. "Caleb," one of them shouted. "That's a service dog, military trained. Look at the tag." Caleb howled again as Rocky adjusted his bite, shifting to the wrist of Caleb's dominant hand. The biker's knife clattered to the ground, kicked aside by Rocky's powerful hind leg. "Stand down, man," Mason called out, stepping forward quickly. "That dog's not playing around. You're not gonna win this fight." Caleb twisted, trying to throw Rocky off, but the dog moved with him, using Caleb's own strength against him. Blood seeped from his jacket sleeve, the fabric darkening fast. Behind them, Ethan lay crumpled on the ground, breathing hard, cradling his broken arm. His face was pale, lips trembling, but his eyes stayed fixed on Rocky. "Rocky," he whispered through clenched teeth. Don't kill him." Whether it was the boy's voice or the years of careful training, Rocky heard. He released Caleb suddenly, taking 2 steps back and standing guard in front of Ethan. His chest heaved, but his eyes were steady, locked onto Caleb like a silent promise, "Move 1 inch closer, and I will not miss again." Caleb stumbled back, clutching his mangled arm. His mouth moved, but no words came out. He stared at the dog with a mix of disbelief and fear. Mason took the chance to move toward Ethan, kneeling slowly and raising his hands. "Hey, kid. I'm not gonna hurt you. Let's get you to a doctor, all right?" Rocky let out a low warning growl. Mason stopped moving. "It's okay," Ethan whispered hoarsely. He helped. Rocky shifted his stance slightly, still cautious but no longer blocking Mason completely. Mason nodded. "All right then. Let's go." Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed himself to his feet, leaning on Rocky as Mason helped guide him. Behind them, the rest of the gang backed away in silence, unsure what they had just witnessed, only knowing they didn't want to see it again. Rocky had protected his boy. And they hadn't seen the last of him. The automatic doors of Silver Creek Medical Center hissed open as Rocky guided Ethan into the brightly lit lobby. The boy's steps were uneven, his face pale and slick with sweat. His arm hung at an awkward angle, the pain radiating in sharp pulses with every heartbeat. A nurse behind the desk looked up, startled by the sight of a child limping through the entrance with a blood-streaked service dog at his side. "We need assistance," she called out, rushing around the counter. "Possible fracture, trauma case." Ethan's knees buckled just as she reached him. Before he hit the ground, Rocky moved beneath his body, absorbing the fall. The nurse gently lowered him onto a stretcher brought by another staff member. Rocky didn't leave his side. Even as they wheeled Ethan down the hallway, the dog stayed close, head low, eyes scanning every face that came too near. No one tried to move him. The patch on his vest said everything. Inside the exam room, Dr. Thomas Reed entered quickly, flanked by a nurse preparing a cast. He examined Ethan's arm with a practiced touch. "Spiral fracture. That was done by force, not a fall," he muttered grimly. "Can you tell me what happened, son?" Ethan's voice was quiet but clear. "A man hurt me. He thought I was someone else. Rocky saved me." Dr. Reed glanced at the dog, who now lay under the gurney, unmoving but alert. "He's my grandpa's dog," Ethan added. "Grandpa trained him." That made the doctor pause. "Howard Walker is your grandfather?" Ethan nodded slowly, wincing at the movement. "He's in the palliative care unit. I came to give him something." Dr. Reed's eyes softened, but his tone stayed professional. "We'll set your arm, then I'll take you to see him. He's been asking for you." A short while later, Ethan's arm was in a bright blue cast. Rocky never moved from his post. Dr. Reed pushed Ethan's wheelchair himself through the quieter hallways of the hospital's upper floor. "Your grandfather and I talked a lot during his treatments," the doctor said gently. "He didn't say much about his pain. He preferred to talk about you. And Rocky." Ethan clutched his backpack, the one holding the picture frame. "I didn't get to give him the gift." Dr. Reed stopped outside a door labeled Walker, H. You will now. "But I should warn you, he's weaker than when you last saw him. Be gentle." Ethan took a breath and nodded. Rocky stood beside him like a statue. They entered quietly. Howard Walker lay in the bed, dwarfed by white sheets and medical equipment. His frame had shrunk, but his eyes opened the moment they stepped inside. "There's my brave boy," Howard whispered. "Right on time." Ethan rushed forward, careful not to bump his cast, and placed the frame on the bedside table. "I made this for you," he said softly. Howard's hand trembled as he reached out, touching the photo. Then his eyes moved to Rocky. "There's blood on his vest," he said. "And it's not Ethan's." Rocky stepped forward. Howard didn't panic. He didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he whispered, "Report." And Rocky made a soft sound, almost like a whine, but layered with rhythm, pattern, intent. Howard listened, understanding. His expression darkened with realization. It was Caleb, wasn't it? Ethan looked up. "He said my name was Carson. That my grandpa knew something. He grabbed me." Rocky stopped him. Howard closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, they were sharp. "It's time you knew the truth," he said. "About Caleb. About Carson. About why Rocky was trained to protect you at all costs." Before Howard could speak another word, a sharp knock echoed from the hallway. Dr. Reed opened the door slightly, his face suddenly tense. "Stay calm," he said quickly. "There's been an incident downstairs." A group of men, bikers, pushed past security. "They're demanding access to this floor." Howard's expression didn't change. "It's him. Caleb's here." Dr. Reed turned to Ethan. "We need to move you both now. We have a secure room in the oncology wing. Fewer access points, reinforced doors." "No," Howard said firmly, his voice thin but unwavering. "That won't stop Caleb. He was Special Forces. He'll know every weak spot in this hospital. But we have to." "I trained him," Howard interrupted. "I know how he thinks. Hiding won't work. We need to move smart, not scared." Just then, the window creaked. All heads turned. A man in a biker jacket swung in from the narrow ledge outside and slipped into the room, moving with smooth, practiced silence. Rocky tensed instantly, stepping between him and Ethan. But Howard raised a hand. "Stand down," he said. "He's one of mine." The man nodded. "Detective Mason Hale. Undercover in Caleb's crew for 11 months. Dr. Reed blinked. "You're a cop." Mason nodded again. "Caleb's out of control. He's convinced this kid is Carson's blood, and he's brought 3 men with him. I heard them planning, if they don't find Ethan fast, they'll start taking hostages. Then we end this now," Howard said. He looked at Ethan, his voice quieter. "You remember the command phrases I taught you?" Ethan nodded. "Good. If anything happens to me, you follow Rocky. You obey him like you'd obey me." Mason turned to the hallway. "I'll lead the way. There's a service corridor to the admin wing. We'll slip through before they lock down the elevators." But they didn't get that far. The elevator at the far end of the hallway dinged softly, and the doors slid open. Caleb stepped out. His arm was bandaged, his expression unreadable, but his eyes found Ethan immediately. And darkened. "You," he said quietly. "You look just like your mother. Like Elizabeth Carson." Howard sat up in the bed with effort. "She's not his mother. You've got it wrong." Caleb ignored him. "I've spent 25 years looking for your family. Your lies killed my brother." Rocky growled, low and steady. Caleb didn't flinch. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. "Where's Carson?" "You're chasing a ghost," Howard said. "Carson's dead. Died 12 years ago." Arlington National Cemetery. I've seen the grave. You're lying. I have proof, Howard said, voice weakening. In a safety box. Let the boy go. He has nothing to do with this. But Caleb wasn't listening. He advanced. Rocky bared his teeth. And then, chaos erupted. 2 more bikers burst through the stairwell door. One grabbed a nurse, another flipped a tray, scattering tools. Mason drew his weapon, shouting, "Police! Drop your weapons!" Caleb hesitated. But the third man, a heavy-set biker with wild eyes, appeared behind Howard's wheelchair, and shoved a scalpel to the old man's throat. "Move and he dies," the biker shouted. Rocky froze. Howard didn't. He looked directly at Ethan. "Now." The boy hesitated only a second. "Rocky, command 2." The retriever exploded into motion. He dove low, knocking the attacker's arm upward. The scalpel sliced harmlessly into the air. Rocky bit hard into the man's wrist, forcing the weapon free. Mason fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The bikers scattered. But Howard's head slumped back. The monitors began to beep in warning. Dr. Reed rushed forward, calling for a crash cart. Ethan stood frozen as Rocky returned to his side, nudging him softly. Howard Walker was slipping away. And he had just bought them one final chance. The hallway buzzed with shouting and chaos, but Caleb didn't run. He stood frozen in place, blood dripping from his bandaged arm, eyes locked on Howard's lifeless body as the medical team wheeled the bed away. His knife lay forgotten on the floor. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest like a stone. 2 hospital security guards approached, weapons drawn, but Caleb didn't resist. He slowly raised his hands, his gaze vacant. Mason stepped forward. "Cuff him," he said quietly. "He's done." As the officers moved in, Caleb turned his head toward Ethan, who stood just a few feet away, clutching Rocky's fur with his uninjured arm. "I thought you were someone else," Caleb muttered. "I thought you were Carson's blood." Ethan didn't answer. His face was blank, but his eyes, wide and wounded, never looked away. Mason pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to one of the detectives who'd just arrived. "Evidence from Howard's safety box," he explained. "Military reports, classified transcripts, original orders. All of it clears Carson. All of it shows your brother wasn't betrayed. He was a whistleblower. Carson tried to protect him." Caleb's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible. He left Alec to die." Mason's voice was firm. "No. He died trying to protect him. The higher-ups buried the truth, and you spent the next 2 decades chasing ghosts." Caleb dropped to his knees. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, but he barely noticed. His shoulders trembled. Ethan stepped back, unsure whether to feel safer, or more afraid. Rocky stood between them, watching both carefully. "I was supposed to protect people," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "That was the mission. But I hurt a kid. I became the thing I hated." Mason didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. As Caleb was led away, he glanced back one more time, not at the officers, not at Mason, but at Ethan. "I'm sorry," he said. Ethan didn't nod. He didn't speak. But Rocky did. The golden retriever sat down, eyes locked on Caleb. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply watched, as if deciding for himself whether this man, broken and bleeding, might ever deserve a second chance. In the quiet that followed, Ethan sat alone in a small consultation room beside the pediatric ward. His casted arm rested on a pillow, and his backpack sat unopened in his lap. Rocky lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes fixed on the door as if still expecting danger. Dr. Reed entered gently, holding a sealed envelope. He sat across from Ethan and placed it on the table between them. "Your grandfather wrote this for you," he said. "He gave it to me last week, just in case." Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for the envelope. Inside was a short letter, written in Howard's bold, precise handwriting. Ethan read it slowly, his lips moving silently. "My dear Ethan. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise to stay with you. But Rocky still can. I trained him for you, not just to protect, but to guide. There's one more thing. If Caleb ever finds you, don't be afraid. He's not just your enemy. He's your legacy too. He was supposed to be your guardian, if I couldn't be." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Guardian? That man?" Dr. Reed saw the look on his face. "Howard filed legal documents naming Caleb Grant as your provisional guardian years ago, before he disappeared. They're still active. But it's not up to the court alone now. It's up to you too." The door opened again. Caleb stepped in, no longer cuffed but flanked by Mason. His eyes were red-rimmed, his posture subdued. He didn't speak at first. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," he finally said. "But I want to try. For your grandpa. For your dad. For you." Ethan didn't answer. He turned to Rocky. The dog stood. Walked across the room. And stopped in front of Caleb. Rocky sniffed the man's hand, slowly, carefully, then pressed his head into Caleb's palm. A gesture not of loyalty, but of recognition. Howard had trained Rocky not just to fight, but to know who to trust. And in that moment, the dog made a decision. Ethan rose from his chair. He didn't speak either. He just crossed the room, leaned into Rocky, and stood beside Caleb. A new bond had begun. Forgiveness could wait. But the door to it had been left open. 1 month later, the house at the edge of Silver Creek looked different. The peeling paint had been replaced with a fresh coat of white. The garden beds were no longer overgrown but neatly trimmed, with small signs marking the herbs Howard once used in his cooking. A new ramp curved up to the porch, built by volunteers from the local veterans group. The same porch where Howard used to sit and drink coffee now held a wooden bench with a worn cushion, Rocky's new favorite spot. Inside, the warmth had returned. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a pencil in his good hand, his cast now decorated with colorful drawings and signatures from neighbors and classmates. His face had regained its softness, though his eyes still held a quiet depth beyond his years. He was focused, tongue peeking out slightly as he colored the final corner of a drawing. Across the paper were 4 stick figures, a boy with a bright blue cast, a tall man with a scruffy beard, a big golden dog with a vest, and an old man with a cane and a smile. Above them, the words, "My family," were written in careful block letters. Rocky lay under the table, as always, his eyes half closed but alert. He didn't need commands anymore to stay close. He knew his boy needed him. The back door creaked open. Caleb entered, carrying 2 bags of groceries in one arm. His appearance had changed too. The leather jacket was gone, replaced with flannel and jeans. The long beard had been trimmed. His eyes, once sharp and vengeful, now looked tired, but grounded. "Miss Raines called," Caleb said, setting the bags on the counter. "She'll be here tomorrow to check on your homeschool progress. You're ahead of schedule, by the way." Ethan grinned. "She likes my reading voice." Caleb smiled. "She's not the only one." He walked over and looked at the drawing. His smile faded slightly as he noticed the 4th figure. "That's Howard, right?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "He's still part of the family. Even if he's gone." There was a long pause. Caleb cleared his throat and turned back to unpacking. Good. He'd like that. The front door opened again. Mason stepped in, holding a stack of envelopes. Mail call, he said cheerfully, handing the letters to Ethan. One caught Caleb's eye, an official envelope from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He opened it slowly. Then blinked in disbelief. They approved it, he murmured. Rehabilitation. Therapy. Job training. They're giving me a shot. Mason grinned. Howard pulled strings before he passed. He believed in second chances. Ethan looked up from his drawing. Me too, he said. Caleb smiled. It wasn't wide or easy, but it was real. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the trees. Inside, something new was taking root, quietly, steadily, like spring after a long winter. The wind whispered through the trees as Ethan walked slowly between rows of headstones, his cast now removed, his step steady but quiet. In one hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers, carefully picked from the edges of the Silver Creek Trail. In the other, he held Rocky's leash, not because he needed it, but because today felt like a day to stay close. Caleb followed a few paces behind, his shoulders squared but his gaze lowered. He carried nothing, only the weight of old memories and promises never kept. Beside him, Mason walked in silence, having driven them both out to the cemetery just outside town. They stopped at 3 graves. The first bore the names of Ethan's parents, David and Caroline Walker, etched into the stone with the symbol of military service beneath them. Ethan knelt and placed the flowers there, brushing a few leaves away from the base. I brought you something, he whispered. We're doing okay. Grandpa's house is still full of your stuff. And Rocky's still with me. Just like you wanted. Rocky sat beside him, tail still, ears up, watching Ethan as if he understood every word. Next, they moved to Howard's grave. The fresh soil had settled now, and a temporary marker still waited to be replaced by a proper stone. Caleb stood in front of it, unmoving. I wish I could say this to your face, Caleb said, voice rough. But you already knew, didn't you? Even when I hated you. Even when I was hunting ghosts, you still saw something worth saving in me. He took a deep breath. I won't waste it. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the picture frame, the same one he had tried to give Howard in the hospital. He placed it gently at the base of the marker. All 4 of them smiled in that photo. A family caught in a better moment. Lastly, they walked together to the 3rd grave, Alec Grant. Caleb's brother. For the longest time, Caleb said nothing. Then he knelt, pressing a hand to the cold stone. I found out the truth, he said quietly. You weren't betrayed. You were protecting something bigger. And I spent half my life blaming the wrong people. I'm sorry, Alec. When he stood, Ethan reached out and took his hand. You said Grandpa wanted you to take care of me. Do you still want to? Caleb's throat tightened. I do. If you'll let me. Ethan nodded. Okay. Behind them, Mason gave them space. Rocky stood between the graves, facing them both. After a moment, the dog walked over to Caleb, then to Ethan, brushing his head against their sides before sitting down between them. The boy. The man. The dog. Linked by blood, by choice, and by something harder to name, legacy. Ethan looked up at the sky, clouds drifting past the late morning sun. Grandpa always said family isn't just who you're born to, he said softly. It's who stands by you when everything falls apart. Caleb looked down at him, eyes wet, and nodded. I'm here, kid. I'm not going anywhere. Every story leaves something behind, a quiet lesson, a moment of reflection, or a reminder of what truly matters. Ethan's journey, guided by Rocky's unwavering loyalty and Howard's enduring love, shows us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes, it's about the people, and even the animals, who stay when things fall apart, who choose to protect, to forgive, and to heal. Caleb spent decades chasing vengeance, blinded by grief and false truths. But even someone lost in anger can find their way back, when someone believes in their second chance. That someone, for Caleb, was Howard. And later, a brave boy with a broken arm and a dog who refused to give up. Rocky didn't just protect Ethan, he became the bridge between generations, between pain and peace, between a fractured past and a hopeful future. This story reminds us that forgiveness is hard. But it's also powerful. That healing doesn't happen all at once, but in small choices, quiet trust, and courage to open the door again. We hope Ethan and Rocky's story touched your heart. If you believe in stories that speak to the soul, about loyalty, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a child and their dog, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt tale. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there's always a path back home. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.